For 3 decades, the red bicycle was never seen again. Not until the day a piece of it emerged from the earth, just 500 meters from home. In February of 1991, the Santa Cândida neighborhood on the north side of Curitiba was still a place where children played soccer in the street, and neighbors knew each other by name. It was a time when gates were left unlocked during the day, and the voices of mothers calling their children indoors echoed across the sidewalks as the sun began to set. On that particular Sunday, the sky was clear and the scent of beans simmering drifted from open kitchens. Around 2 in the afternoon, 8-year-old Eduardo Nunes de Almeida asked his mother for permission to take his bike for a ride before the Sunday night news program began. His mother, Donna Selma, hesitated. The school year had just started and he hadn't finished his homework. But as she always did, she relented with one condition: just half an hour and stay on the upper street. Eduardo was riding a red bicycle covered in stickers of jaspion, a gift from his father who had died of a stroke 2 years earlier. Since then, he had been the only child at home, raised with twice the attention. He was a quiet boy, almost shy but quick-witted. He knew how to assemble his toys on his own and was always asking to learn how to fix the old radio in the living room. At 2:32 p.m. he headed out, his sandals loose on his feet and his hair still damp from his bath. He wore a light-colored t-shirt with a blue print and denim shorts. He passed the house of Donna Mariana, a 74-year-old neighbor who often sat on her wicker chair with a glass of iced mate tea. She waved and said, "Going far, Dudu?" He smiled back. "Just to the corner, Grandma Mari." That was the last recorded contact with Eduardo Nunes. Minutes later, Donna Mariana would recall hearing the clatter of his bicycle chain as he turned the corner onto Vicente Sicarino Street, heading toward a vacant lot at the end of the road. After that, the sound of the bike's clicking freewheel was gone. So was the sound of his laughter cutting through the wind. Around 3:15 p.m., Selma stepped out onto her porch, a dish towel still in her hands. She called Eduardo's name 3 times, but only the echo returned. She tried to smile, telling herself he must be at his friend Cayo's house, 3 blocks up. Within 20 minutes, she had knocked on 4 different doors. Within an hour, she had called the police. By 6:00 p.m., the first report was filed. Patrol car doing 283 circled the nearby streets but found no trace of him. By 8:00 p.m., the news was on the city radio. 8-year-old boy disappears in Curitiba. The search began that same night. Flashlights swept across backyards, vacant lots, even water tanks. A wave of concern washed over the community. The next day, some 40 volunteers and 3 police sniffer dogs were deployed to scan the surrounding areas. This included the old abandoned lumberyard sealed by a rusty gate that neighbors said was used to store forgotten machinery. But there, the dogs found nothing. For the first 7 days, the case was featured prominently on local radio and in small articles in the print newspapers. The image of Eduardo, smiling with a gap between his front teeth and his eyes squinted from the sun, circulated throughout Curitiba. At his school, a mural of posters bearing his face was pasted next to the main entrance. At the neighborhood bus terminal, an employee thought he might have seen him board a bus heading toward Colombo, but the internal security camera footage was never recovered. The bicycle, too, had vanished completely. No sign, no sound, not even a wheel tossed in a nearby creek. It was as if Eduardo had evaporated into thin air. In the weeks that followed, theories emerged. Did he run away? Was he taken? Did he have an accident? Did he wander onto a construction site and fall? But there were no open wells, no dense woods, no plots of land that hadn't been turned upside down. At least that's what the reports claimed. The family's anguish turned into a protest. Donna Selma, her eyes hollow from crying, went to the city council to plead that her son's case not be shelved. 3 months later, a state commission for the support of missing children was created, with Eduardo's name at the very top of its list. But despite the campaigns, the posters, the promises, and the investigations, nothing was discovered. No one other than Donna Mariana had seen anything. Not a single object was recovered. No new leads surfaced, not even as the years passed. In 1993, the case was officially closed due to a lack of evidence, and the neighborhood moved on. The streets were repaved in 2001. The corner market became a franchise. The church got a new facade, but the house at number 133, on the corner of Vicente Sicarino, remained the same. The white gate peeling, ferns on the porch, and a mother sitting on the same sofa waiting for the day someone might ring the doorbell with news. 30 years of silence followed. The house stood in the same place, but everything around it had changed. Everything except the emptiness. By the time 10 years had passed since Eduardo's disappearance, few newspapers even remembered him. A few talk shows tried to reenact the case in sensationalized segments, but Donna Selma refused every invitation. "This is not a spectacle," she would say. "It is an absence." In the early 2000s, new apartment buildings rose in Santa Cândida. The flow of traffic increased, and the old lumberyard, long abandoned, was sold and divided into three parts: a small logistics center, a warehouse for agricultural machinery, and a walled-off area that remained sealed. No one knew exactly why. One rumor claimed it was due to legal disputes. Another suggested soil contamination. The fact was, that piece of land, about 500 meters from the Nunes de Almeida home, remained untouched for decades. Selma remained there, alone. Her husband had died in 1989. After her son vanished, she never entered another relationship. She lived on odd jobs, a disability pension, and help from a niece who visited once a week. The neighbors respected her, but many avoided contact. A silent sorrow seemed to envelop the house, as if to step inside was to step into a time that had stopped. In 2011, she was interviewed for a documentary about missing people in Brazil. Her most powerful line came at the end of the recording. "When you bury a child," she said, "your heart bleeds, but when you can't bury them, it rots in silence." In the years that followed, Eduardo became a statistic. His name was used in seminars, academic theses, and civil police archives, but in practice, he remained what he had always been: missing. Then in 2021, exactly 30 years after the day he vanished, the walled-off section of the old lumberyard was put up for sale. An engineering firm specializing in the structural renovation of abandoned properties bought the entire lot, intending to build a shopping center with a parking lot. The first phase of the project was clearing and excavation, as much of the ground was uneven and overgrown with roots, rubble, and scraps of wood and metal. In June of that year, crews began to work on the site. Residents soon noticed the movement of heavy machinery, the roar of the tractor, and the constant flow of workers. For the first time in a long time, that forgotten piece of land began to be overturned. On the third day of excavation, around 4 p.m., one of the employees, a 26-year-old backhoe operator named Luciano, noticed that the tractor had pulled up a tangle of roots and compacted earth. As he approached to inspect it by hand, he saw a rusty gleam in the mud. Thinking it was just some metal cable, he pulled at it with his gloved hands and realized it was a wheel. But not just any wheel. It was the wheel of a child's bicycle, an old model with a chrome rim and a red plastic hub partially corroded by time. It was trapped between branches and hardened sediment, as if it had been swallowed by the roots of a tree. Next to it, partially buried, was a piece of blue and white fabric with a faded cartoon print. Luciano called his foreman, who immediately called the police. In less than 2 hours, the site was cordoned off. A forensics expert confirmed that the materials were old and could have been there for many years. That's when the rumors began to ripple through the neighborhood. Could it belong to the boy, Eduardo? The news reached the press in less than 24 hours. The case was back on television, a possible breakthrough in one of the oldest child disappearances in the state of Paraná. The prosecutor who had handled the case in the 90s was now retired, but the homicide division reopened the investigation. When Eduardo's mother saw the image of the T-shirt on television, dirty, torn, and caked in mud, she sank to her kitchen floor. Even through the grime, she recognized it. It was one of her son's favorite shirts bought at a street fair in the Bacacheri neighborhood. It had a slightly crooked seam, and the little bear printed in the right corner was still there, still visible. In the following days, the area was fully excavated. They also found a small metal chain with the letter E hanging from it, which his mother confirmed was Eduardo's, a gift from a cousin for Christmas in 1990. A few meters away, a pocket knife with a wooden handle, rusted but with its clasp still intact, was pulled from the earth. Genetic material from the T-shirt was sent for analysis at the Paraná Forensics Institute. The report came back in 14 days. The result was delivered in a short, definitive sentence. Material compatible with the genetic profile of Eduardo Nunes de Almeida. The boy who disappeared in 1991 had finally been located, but there was no body, no bones, no human remains, just a torn T-shirt, a rusty wheel, and 30 years of silence that were once again making noise. If you've made it this far, it's because you also feel the weight of these silences. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories like this one. Real cases that were forgotten for years, but that still deserve to be heard. Let's continue. The T-shirt had returned. So had the wheel. But the body had not. The neighborhood was overcome with emotion in a matter of hours. Older residents wept as they saw the images of what had been found. People who had watched Eduardo grow up, who remembered the searches, the smell of earth turned over by dogs, the wail of sirens in the night. It was as if everyone had been pulled back to February of 1991. But with the pain came indignation. How had no one seen it? How had it been there for so long, just a few hundred meters from his mother's house? On the Monday following the discovery, the civil police held a press conference. The new lead detective on the case was present, along with a public prosecutor and two of the forensic experts who analyzed the site. The main question asked by nearly every reporter in the room was direct. Was this area not investigated during the original search? The detective took a deep breath before answering. According to the records from the time, part of the property was considered restricted access and the dogs did not detect any scent that would have justified breaking the gate. Officially, there is no record of a complete sweep of the area where the objects were found. Donna Selma watched the press conference from the same armchair where she had watched the fall of the Berlin Wall in the '94 World Cup. She wasn't crying anymore. She just clutched a small rosary between her fingers, her eyes fixed on the screen. The following week, a new piece of the puzzle emerged. One of the retired investigators from the original case, a former clerk named Jorge Lima, now 68, agreed to an interview with a reporter from the Gazeta do Povo newspaper. What he said changed the course of the investigation. Back then, he said, there was an informal order from above not to push too hard in that area. No one explained why. They just told us to focus on the other regions. According to Jorge, part of the land had been embroiled in a legal inheritance dispute between three brothers, one of whom had local political connections. There was an interest in keeping the property untouched until the litigation was resolved. It was one of those unspoken requests, he added. Everyone knew, but no one said it out loud. The revelation landed like a bomb. The public prosecutor's office opened a procedure to reevaluate the steps of the 1991 investigation. Missing documents, incomplete records, inexplicable gaps. The case, once treated as a disappearance, was now being investigated as a possible concealment of a body, even without mortal remains. A new team was assigned exclusively to review every detail. A 3D map of the area was created and drones conducted a full sweep of the land. A deeper excavation began days later. Although they found no bones, they identified other objects buried nearby. A broken lunchbox lid, a piece of metal that looked like part of a child's pedal, and a newspaper clipping rolled up in a plastic bag. The clipping, dated March 1991, was an article about Eduardo's disappearance. This was the discovery that most intrigued the investigators. The question was unavoidable. Why would someone bury a news story about the disappearance in the exact spot where the child's belongings were hidden? The mood in the city shifted. The case, once remembered with sadness, now sparked outrage. Protests began to surface on social media with posts marked by phrases like 30 years 500 meters away and how many more are in there. A petition was created demanding that the authorities from that time be held accountable. In a few weeks, it had over 50,000 signatures. Meanwhile, Donna Selma remained silent. She gave no interviews, made no public appearances, and did not respond to messages from reporters. The silence finally broke on August 12th, when the chief inspector called her to personally identify the items that had been found. She arrived accompanied by a retired civil police officer, a friend of the family. She walked slowly into the Curitiba Forensic Institute, clutching a folder filled with documents and old photographs. She was led to a room where the objects were laid out on a stainless steel table. She needed no more than 10 seconds. She pointed to the t-shirt, glanced at the necklace, and said, "They're his." Then she sat down heavily, opened the folder, and pulled out a photo of Eduardo, taken just 3 days before he disappeared. In the image, he was wearing that exact blue and white t-shirt, smiling beside his red bicycle, his bare feet on the cobblestones. The same shirt, the same print, the same child. Selma then removed a smaller envelope from the folder. Inside was a store receipt for the purchase of the t-shirt and the chain with the letter E, both registered in 1990. The examiner simply nodded. It was confirmed. The final report submitted to the public prosecutor's office cited compatible genetic material. Objects verified by documentation, visual identification by the mother, and strong evidence of intentional concealment. But the question that had loomed from the very beginning still needed an answer. How had this gone unnoticed for 30 years? What haunted them now wasn't just the absence. It was the fact that someone at some point had chosen to bury it. Slowly, the case transformed from a mystery of the past into a contemporary scandal. On the radio, Eduardo's name was spoken with indignation. Online, videos of the discovery amassed millions of views in a matter of days. One of them showed, uncut, the excavation of the bicycle. The wheel being pulled from the roots, the torn fabric emerging, the earth slowly giving way, as if time itself were being dug up by hand. The Curitiba City Hall issued an official statement expressing its deep regret and promising full cooperation in the new investigation. The governor also made a public address. But for the people, the words always seemed to come too late. The prosecutor in charge of the case, Dr. Andre Valença, had grown up in Curitiba in the 90s and vaguely remembered the commotion from his teenage years. Now, responsible for one of the state's most significant reopened inquiries, he pored over cardboard boxes filled with newspaper clippings, typewritten reports, and old blueprints of the property. That was how he discovered a curious fact. The first blueprint of the area from 1987 showed a side annex on the property, a kind of external storage unit separate from the main warehouse with its own entrance through a smaller wooden gate. This annex no longer existed. It had been demolished in mid-1993 according to demolition records. But during the period of the disappearance, it had been active. The question was simple. Was it ever searched? The answer appeared to be no. In the search reports from 1991, there was no mention of the annex. Not a single citation, no record of access. The wooden gate had seemingly been ignored under the justification that the area showed no signs of disturbance. The only observation about the location was a marginal note made by an investigator at the time. Side gate locked. No sign of forced entry. Dogs did not alert, proceeded along the west side. In other words, no entry, no search. Dr. Valenza ordered a new forensic analysis of the land where the annex once stood. They used ground-penetrating radar capable of identifying soil disturbances in deep layers. The results showed at least 2 areas with old excavations later filled with concrete and earth, about 2 meters deep. The team began digging at the most promising spot. On the 4th day of work, they found an incomplete foundation structure with pieces of rotten wood and small fragments of rusted objects. Among them, a piece of blue plastic the size of a hand. It was later identified as part of the rear mudguard of a children's bicycle from the 1980s, a Caloi model. More evidence that the entire bicycle had been there at some point. That same week, a name began to surface behind the scenes of the investigation. Arlindo Lacerda, the brother of one of the lumberyard's former owners. He had been mentioned informally by a former neighbor who said Arlindo used to watch over the property on weekends, even after the company had closed. He was described as reserved, averse to children, and standoffish. As it turned out, Arlindo Lacerda had never been questioned by the police in 1991. Today, at 73, he lives on a small farm in the Campo Magro region, 40 kilometers from the capital. Upon learning he would be contacted, he hired a criminal lawyer and refused to speak voluntarily, claiming fragile health and a poor memory of that time. He said only that he had nothing to do with it and didn't even know the boy had disappeared nearby. But one detail caught the investigators' attention. In the original case file, there was a faint, almost erased note reporting that in March 1991, 1 month after the disappearance, a man with a physical description matching Arlindo's was seen inside the warehouse by a delivery driver around 7 a.m., a time when the property was supposed to be closed. The note was never investigated. No follow-up was ever done. Given this, the prosecutor requested that Arlindo be formally subpoenaed to testify. The defense tried to block it, citing emotional fragility and advanced age. But the judge authorized the hearing, provided it was conducted at his home with medical supervision. On October 4, 2021, 3 court officers, a chief inspector, and a criminal psychologist went to the farm. Arlindo received them on his porch, courteous but cold. He said he was being treated like a criminal without any proof and that he would never harm a child. He then answered their questions evasively. "Do you remember the day, February 24, 1991? "No, that was over 30 years ago. Where were you living at the time?" "I think in Colombo, or maybe still here. I'm not sure." "Did you used to visit the lumberyard warehouse?" "Sometimes I'd go to see if anything had been stolen, but nothing major." "Did you ever see the boy, Eduardo?" "No, I didn't even know who he was." The conversation lasted just over 40 minutes, but when the inspector asked if Arlindo knew about the old annex, he hesitated. "What annex?" "A side building where there are now buried foundations. It was on the lumberyard blueprints." Arlindo scratched his forehead, looked away, and replied, "Oh, That thing was demolished quickly. I don't remember it being used for anything. That sentence was enough to raise suspicion. The structure was only demolished in 1993. If he claimed not to remember it, how did he know when it was torn down? His behavior was described in the report as evasive, contradictory, and emotionally defensive. The public prosecutor's office began to consider requesting a warrant for his banking and telephone records from that era, even though such old files would be difficult to retrieve. Meanwhile, public pressure mounted. Posters with Eduardo's face were plastered on city walls with the words, "If they buried the truth, the whole city will dig." Slowly, the case was no longer just about a missing boy. It was becoming about who wanted him to never be found. The city was digging, but what it was unearthing wasn't just dirt. It was the decisions that had been buried along with it. While the investigation into Arlindo Lacerda intensified, the forensic work continued. Silent, patient, centimeter by centimeter. 3 more points of interest were identified on the old lumberyard property. At one of them, they located what appeared to be a fragment of a child's sneaker, almost unrecognizable but with a piece of the sole still intact. It was an old model from the Bomba brand, common in the 80s and early 90s, worn by boys to play soccer, ride bikes, and go to school. Selma confirmed that Eduardo had owned a similar pair. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was one more piece in a 3-decade-old puzzle. With the objects gathered, the t-shirt, the bicycle wheel, the necklace, the pocket knife, the lunchbox lid, the piece of the sneaker, and the buried newspaper, the public prosecutor's office compiled a 42-page technical report. It was delivered to the Paraná Court of Justice in December 2021. The document presented a new official hypothesis. The discovered elements and the absence of documented searches in the lateral sector of the property point to a possible intentional concealment of evidence, with operational failure or negligence as part of the original investigation. The word negligence gained traction, but in some circles another word was whispered: cover-up. Who would have had an interest in preventing that area from being searched in 1991, and why? It was then that Clarissa Telles, an investigative reporter for a local publication, decided to dig into the story on her own. She scoured public archives, interviewed former lumberyard employees, and managed to contact an ex-lawyer who had handled a dispute between the Lacerda brothers in the 90s. According to this lawyer, there was friction between the brothers at the time over an internal incident, which involved an anonymous tip about the property being used for the illegal storage of materials. The case was dismissed in 1992, and the contents of the tip disappeared from the physical files of the Curitiba courthouse, reportedly due to document misplacement. But a phrase jotted on an old piece of paper kept by the lawyer himself caught Clarissa's attention. It was written in pen next to a date. Check on the case of the boy on the corner. Avoid exposure. The date was March 1991. Clarissa took the paper to the police station. The inspector in charge of the new phase of the case made no official comment, but he confirmed to the press days later that they were evaluating the possibility of external interference in the original investigation. In the Santa Cândida neighborhood, reactions were mixed. Some older residents wanted to forget, others demanded public explanations. And then there were those who tried to protect Arlindo, like 83-year-old Odete, his childhood neighbor. Arlindo was always withdrawn, but he never hurt anyone, she said from her doorstep. They just want someone to blame, that's all. But the biggest question persisted. Where was the body? The absence of human remains made everything more agonizing. If someone had hidden the objects, where was the rest? Was it possible that Eduardo had been taken to another location and his belongings brought back later? Or, the most disturbing hypothesis, did it all happen right there in the annex and someone with access buried the evidence before the police could search? In early 2022, the public prosecutor's office decided to create a virtual reconstruction of the case. They used 3D maps, digital models, and witness statements to recreate Eduardo's last afternoon. The simulation, based on the accounts from the time, suggested that the boy could have gone down the side street, one that passed in front of the lumberyard's old wooden gate. The last person to see him, a woman named Mariana, said she saw him turn the corner, and that corner today was just 37 meters from the warehouse's side entrance. This led to a new hypothetical timeline. Eduardo leaves home at 2:32 p.m. He is seen turning the corner at 2:34 p.m. Between 2:35 and 2:40 p.m., he would have passed the side gate, where he could have been intercepted by someone he knew. The area was never searched. By March, his belongings were already buried, as suggested by the plastic-wrapped newspaper dated from that month. Everything pointed to a window of less than 10 minutes between the last sighting and his complete disappearance. Was it a swift kidnapping, a concealed accident, a deliberate act? The reconstruction gained national attention when it was featured in a TV Brazil special, with the story of Eduardo's path illustrated by real-time animation. At the end, the screen showed the distance between his mother's house and the excavation site, 493 meters. A number that came to symbolize everything that wasn't done. 493 meters of questions without an answer. Selma, for her part, continued her same routine. Every Wednesday she washed the sidewalk. Every Friday she left artificial flowers next to Eduardo's photo on the living room shelf. And every Sunday she lit a small candle in the backyard, like someone who expects nothing more yet still refuses to give up. She didn't ask for justice. She never used the word guilty. She only said in a single interview, "I just wanted to know what he felt, if it hurt, if he was scared, if he called for me." And then she fell silent for nearly a minute. The entire city seemed to stop with her. The neighborhood had changed, the neighbors had changed, but the void that began on that February day never left the street. The year 2022 brought an unexpected development in Eduardo's case: the arrival of a federal task force, requested by the Paraná Public Prosecutor's Office and supported by the National Secretariat for Children's Rights. The justification was clear. This was no longer just a disappearance, but a possible systemic violation involving negligence, omission, and potentially the improper protection of suspects. The case was officially renamed Operation 493, in reference to the distance between the boy's home and the spot where his belongings were found. 3 prosecutors, 2 federal chief inspectors, and a team of federal forensic experts were dispatched to Curitiba. Their focus was twofold: to review the conduct of the original investigation and to determine the potential criminal liability of Arlindo Lacerda. In this new phase, an old character reappeared. Lieutenant Luiz Gonzaga Ferreira, now retired and living in Florianopolis, had been in charge of the search with sniffer dogs back in 1991. Contacted by the task force, he agreed to give a voluntary statement, and his words brought forth unprecedented details. "At the time," he said, "we received clear orders to prioritize the open areas. The orders came from on high, from regional command. The official line was that entering the lumberyard property would require a court order, as it was under litigation. I remember insisting, but I received a direct reprimand. They told me, 'That's just asking for trouble, Gonzaga. It'll lead to a lawsuit.'" The testimony was cross-referenced with internal police documents, and, for the first time, evidence emerged suggesting the original investigation had been deliberately steered away from a portion of the land. Dona Selma was informed of this by phone 2 days later. She listened to it all in silence, then said only, "You didn't have to tell me. I always knew." She never said how or why, but she would state with a painful serenity that her boy had never gone far. Meanwhile, new forensic analyses pointed to a staggering fact. The bicycle fragments and other recovered objects were found at different depths. The T-shirt and the chain, for instance, were about 80 centimeters deep. The wheel and the lunchbox lid were at 110 meters. The piece of newspaper and the sneaker fragment were found at 140 meters. This indicated that the material may have been buried at different times or at least rearranged in the ground later. The discovery reinforced the hypothesis that the items had been moved or repositioned over time. They weren't simply where they had fallen. Someone had placed them there, deliberately, in overlapping layers, almost like someone hiding something to ensure it would never be seen again. The most dreaded possibility began to be considered. The objects might have been placed there years after the disappearance. If that were true, it changed everything. It would mean that the site was, in fact, used in 1991. But the items were reburied there later, perhaps to close a circle, erase traces, or confuse any future searches. The press was divided between two main theories. The first was immediate concealment in 1991. Eduardo was taken to the location and killed there. The objects were buried in the annex, which was never searched. When the annex was demolished in 1993, the traces remained underground, covered by rubble. The second theory was later displacement. Eduardo was taken and killed elsewhere. Some of his belongings were brought back to the property in the following years, perhaps out of fear of them being discovered at another address, or out of remorse. The federal police ruled out no hypothesis. It was at this stage that the task force decided to investigate the demolition of the annex in 1993. They discovered that the demolition had been contracted to a third-party company named Reconcil Engenharia, which then subcontracted local labor. And among the names of the workers from that time, one stood out. João Batista Lacerda, Arlindo's direct nephew. João Batista had worked on the demolition of the annex for 3 days. He confirmed this in his deposition. He said he hadn't noticed anything strange, but when asked why he was working on a family property without a formal contract, he replied that he was doing his uncle a favor. The answer struck investigators as odd. In the same deposition, João said something that might have gone unnoticed if not for the recording. "We were just cleaning up there because they said no one had touched that corner in years. There was a lot of junk lying around. Old paper, a piece of a tire. I even saw a little kid's sandal there, but it must have been from the construction site, I don't know." The investigators immediately asked him to repeat himself. "A sandal? Yeah, I think so. It was a bit torn, but that was a long time ago." That passage became a key point in the report for Operation 493. Over the following days, they excavated the area of the old demolition with even greater care. Beneath a broken concrete slab, they found wood fragments from the original annex floor, along with nails, hardware, and what appeared to be a metal buckle from a child's belt. Everything was sent for analysis. Meanwhile, Arlindo maintained his silence. His lawyer released a statement saying he would make no further declarations on medical and legal advice. The suspicion surrounding him, however, was solidifying. At the end of March, the task force conducted a new reenactment, this time simulating the hypothesis that Eduardo had been lured away by someone he knew. The simulation suggested that if the boy had stopped in front of the side gate and been called over by someone from the lumber yard, he could have entered without raising any suspicion. This would explain the absence of screams, running, or noise, things no one reported hearing that day. When his mother was asked if Eduardo knew anyone from the lumber yard, she answered in a low voice, "I think he had seen Arlindo before. He would pass by the front sometimes, but I can't say if he trusted him." The most unsettling doubt hung in the air. What if it was precisely that trust, small, subtle, childish, that had led him to his end? For 3 decades, everyone had looked forward. Now they were forced to look back with a magnifying glass. Operation 493 continued at an intense pace. With each new discovery, more questions arose. The public followed the case, so old yet so present, with unusual attention. Social media was flooded with messages like, "I was his age. I used to walk down that street. That could have been me." But while the digital world debated possibilities, in the real world the investigation was entering a delicate phase, attempting to reconstruct Arlindo Lacerda's behavior in the months following the disappearance. To do this, investigators began interviewing people who had known him between 1991 and 1994. The profile that emerged was of a reserved man with little social interaction, who spent most of his time on the lumberyard property, even after the business had formally closed. He wasn't married, had no children, and maintained no known close relationships, but there was a pattern that caught their attention. Every person interviewed reported a significant change in Arlindo's behavior after March 1991. What was once a frequent presence in the neighborhood became reclusion. The man who used to walk to the corner bakery vanished for months. Some thought he had moved away. Others said they saw him cleaning the property alone, always at dawn. A neighbor, Nair, now 76, gave a testimony considered crucial. "I remember one day, it must have been in the autumn of that year," she said. "I woke up earlier than usual, went to hang laundry before 7, and I saw Arlindo across the street standing at the lumberyard gate. He was sweaty, his shirt was dirty, and he had a shovel leaning against the wall." "Do you remember what day it was, ma'am?" "I don't remember the exact day, but it was a few weeks after the boy went missing. I remember thinking, what is that man doing there so early?" This testimony led forensics to reanalyze the soil on the property around the old gate. In one specific spot, they found traces of disturbed sediment with different characteristics from the surrounding areas, including ash mixed with deformed metal fragments. They were taken for analysis. The results pointed to residues from the burning of textile and plastic material, likely done in a makeshift fire. Although there was no way to prove a direct link to Eduardo's case, the fact that it was in the exact spot described by Dona Nair strengthened the suspicion. The public prosecutor's office began to consider that after concealing the objects, someone had tried to destroy some of the original material. The reason, however, remained a mystery. Fear? Guilt? Precaution? There were more questions than answers. Faced with this, Prosecutor Andre Valença decided to take a step that would divide opinion. He publicly acknowledged that there was consistent evidence of police negligence and the possibility of Arlindo Lacerda's involvement in the concealment. In an official statement, he said, Arlindo's defense responded 2 days later with a short note. Among the documents recovered by the task force was an old logbook for entries and exits at the lumberyard. It had been kept by an administrative employee and contained notes up to February 1991. On one of the last pages, there was a line written by hand in a hurried script. Feb 25. Lacerda arrived before 6 o'clock p.m., said he needed to sort something out back there, left around 9 o'clock p.m. This entry referred to the day after Eduardo's disappearance. It was the kind of banal administrative note that had likely never been read by anyone until that moment. But now, in 2022, it became a central piece of evidence. Arlindo had been at the lumberyard the day after the boy vanished, at an unusual time, and had left a record that he had something to sort out back there. The lead detective of Operation 493 stated that the passage would be incorporated into the inquiry as indirect evidence of suspicious behavior. While it didn't prove a crime, it reinforced the timeline of events and Arlindo's proximity to the place where the objects were buried. It was in this context that Dona Selma was once again approached by the press. This time she agreed to speak, seated at her kitchen table, her hands resting on a black and white portrait of her son. She answered the questions calmly. When asked if she wanted to see Arlindo in prison, she replied, "A prison sentence ends one day, but the truth, when it comes, lasts forever." At the end of the interview, the journalist asked if she thought her son had been there the whole time. "I don't know," she said, "but I know something was, something no one wanted to find." That sentence began to be reproduced everywhere. It was painted on a wall, printed on T-shirts, and became a newspaper headline. And at that moment, the case ceased to be just the story of a lost boy. It was the story of a city that, for 30 years, had lived alongside something it refused to see. It was as if, for 30 years, everyone had been walking over a poorly buried truth. And now the ground was beginning to give way. After Dona Selma's public statement, something transformed in the Eduardo case and in the city as well. The public shock gave way to mobilization. The central square of the Santa Cândida neighborhood began to host candlelit vigils every Friday. A bench was painted red with the inscription, "493 meters cannot be ignored." The public pressure, combined with the accumulated evidence, forced a new legal step. On May 5, 2022, the Public Prosecutor's Office of Paraná requested that the state court open a criminal case against Arlindo Lacerda for concealment of evidence and obstruction of a criminal investigation. The request was based on 3 pillars: Arlindo's direct and unjustified access to the lumberyard area in the days following the disappearance, the presence of items buried in areas under his supervision and without authorized police access in 1991, and the partial destruction of physical evidence possibly carried out by an improvised fire on the property. The judge on duty partially accepted the complaint. He ordered Arlindo to be brought in for a formal interrogation, with the possibility of remaining free pending trial, as he was a first-time offender of advanced age and had a fixed residence. The interrogation was scheduled for May 16th. The news generated apprehension. It was the first time in over 30 years that someone was being formally held responsible for any aspect of the disappearance of Eduardo Nunes de Almeida. Arlindo's name divided opinions on the streets. For some, he was a scapegoat. For others, the missing link. On the morning of the 16th, the scene was tense. Police cars in front of the farm, journalists gathered, neighbors watching in silence. Arlindo left his house supported by his lawyer and did not say a single word to the press. He was taken to the civil police headquarters in Curitiba, where he remained for 3 hours. During the interrogation, he denied all accusations. He said he did not know about the objects on the property, that he did not see Eduardo that day, and that his visit to the site in 1991 was for administrative reasons. He claimed the note in the logbook was a coincidence, but when confronted with the recorded phrase, "to sort something out back there," his voice trembled. "Can you explain what that something was, sir?" Arlindo hesitated for 7 seconds before answering. "I don't remember. It could have been anything." The recording was analyzed by a body language expert who described the behavior as evasive, indicative of selective memory with elements of emotional distress. Despite this, there was no arrest. Arlindo returned to his farm that same afternoon, but the strain was visible. A few days later, his lawyer requested a partial gag order on the proceedings, citing threats received through social media. The court granted it. From then on, the legal process would continue out of the public eye. On the investigation side, efforts focused on finding potential indirect witnesses who might have seen movements at the time, even without understanding their significance. It was in this context that a woman named Rosangela Duarte came forward. She now lived in Londrina but had lived in Santa Cândida between 1989 and 1993. She voluntarily approached the prosecutor's office, saying she had kept something to herself for many years. Her testimony, recorded on video, was revealing. "I worked as a maid in a house near the lumber yard. One day after the boy went missing, I saw a man entering the side of the shed with a large bag on his back. It was early, must have been before 7. He looked from side to side and went in quickly. I thought it was strange, but I didn't say anything. I was scared, but now, seeing all this, I think it might have been important." "Would you recognize the man?" "Not for sure, but he looked like the one on television, Mr. Arlindo." Rosangela described his clothes: a light plaid shirt, dark pants, a cap. Investigators cross-referenced the description with old photos of Arlindo taken during that period. It was a match. Even with decades of distance, the testimony reignited doubts. Behind the scenes, a feeling was growing among the experts. Someone had acted with time, calm, and knowledge of the terrain. It didn't seem to have been an impulsive act. It was done with care, like someone who knew that no one would ever enter there. But if Arlindo was involved, did he act alone? The question launched a new phase of the investigation, one focused on analyzing potential accomplices, even indirect ones. Among them, one name resurfaced: João Batista Lacerda, the nephew who had worked on the demolition of the annex back in 1993. His involvement had seemed minor until now, but he was the only one who admitted to seeing children's items on the property during the demolition. Summoned to testify once more, João stuck to his original story but revealed a new detail. Arlindo had given him strange instructions. What kind of instructions? He couldn't say exactly. Only that Arlindo had ordered him to dig deeper in one specific spot, claiming the floor was rotten. "Did you dig?" an investigator asked. "I dug a little, yes," João replied. "But then he told me to stop and cover it with rubble." This new information bolstered the theory that the ground had been manipulated before the property was sold. By this point, the case file had swelled to over 400 pages. The press was treating it as one of the most sensitive cases in the recent history of Paraná. And yet, Eduardo's body had never been found. What had been buried under the earth for 30 years was now spreading across documents, testimonies, and scars. João Batista Lacerda's interrogation marked a new turning point in Operation 493. For the first time, there was evidence that other people knew something was buried on that land and had actively participated in keeping it from the police. The public ministry chose not to make this new line of investigation public. Officially, the focus remained on Arlindo, but among the prosecutors, the perception was clear. The silence of 3 decades had not been spontaneous. It had been constructed. As the investigation advanced, a new inquiry was made at the company responsible for the 1993 demolition. There, in a long-forgotten dead file, investigators found an old envelope, marked in blue ink. Lacerda Lumber, Side Project, March 93. Inside were 3 simple receipts and a single sheet of scratch paper. The first receipt recorded the purchase of cement and stones for filling a shallow foundation. The second noted the removal of clean rubble from the site. And the third was a casual payment to a bricklayer with no social security number, only a first name, Valdecir. But it was the scratch paper that caught their attention. It was a hand-drawn floor plan of the property with an area marked in red. Beside the mark, an almost illegible note, "Level before closing." This indicated that before pouring concrete over the very spot where the bicycle fragments and objects were found, someone had taken care to leave the ground perfectly leveled and sealed, as if they wanted to ensure no one would ever disturb it again. The document was sent for forensic analysis, which confirmed the paper's authenticity and estimated its creation to be between February and April of 1993. 2 years after the disappearance, Someone was still controlling the ground at that site. This new clue reinforced a chilling interpretation. The traces hadn't been buried casually, nor in a hurry. They had been placed with the intention of remaining hidden forever. Meanwhile, Donna Selma's health was failing. The emotional turmoil of recent months, compounded by decades of accumulated pain, triggered anxiety attacks and memory lapses. She was hospitalized for several days with an arrhythmia. Close neighbors visited, but she rarely spoke, spending hours just staring at the gate. A nurse recounted that she would repeat the same phrase in a whisper over and over. "He must have called for me." Faced with this, the task force made a decision. They would go to her, not to take a deposition, but to show her what they had discovered. It was a symbolic gesture. There wasn't much more they could prove in court. The case against Arlindo was moving slowly, with little chance of a firm conviction without human remains or a direct witness. But the investigators wanted something more. They wanted to give her the closest version of the truth they could find. On July 21, 2022, two prosecutors and a psychologist went to the house at number 183, on the corner of Vicente Sicarino. They sat with Selma in her living room. They showed her copies of the maps, photos of the objects, the reconstructed timeline. They explained everything, calmly. She listened in silence for nearly an hour, interrupting only once when she saw the photo of the bicycle wheel still bearing the faint trace of a red sticker. "This sticker?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Did I put it on with him?" The psychologist reported that at the end of the meeting, Donna Selma took the hands of both prosecutors, looked them in the eyes, and said, "I no longer have the strength to keep asking for justice, but I thank you for trying to make sure he wasn't forgotten." Her words were recorded in the operation's final report as a declaration of the symbolic closure of the maternal search. In practice, the investigation was not yet over. But there, in that house, a story was coming to an end. In the following months, the task force focused its efforts on finding the bricklayer Valdecir mentioned on the 1993 receipt. After searching through more than 40 registry offices and informal records, they located a man with that name who had worked on construction sites in the region that year. He now lived in the interior of Sao Paulo and was interviewed via video conference. Valdecir, now 64, said he didn't remember the details of the job. But when shown the hand-drawn floor plan, he recognized the handwriting. "I think it belongs to one of the bosses," he said. "The one named Arlindo." He claimed he didn't know what was in the ground, only that he was instructed to pour concrete over an area already leveled with rubble. When asked if this was a common practice, he replied, "Not really. Normally we level with gravel, not rubble, but the boss said he wanted to get it over with quickly." His words were another brick in the wall of suspicion. Nothing was definitive. No single piece of evidence proved the crime. But together they formed the grim portrait of a story that had been told in half-truths for 3 decades. At the end of the inquiry, the prosecutors decided to attach a special note to the case file, written in plain language. The disappearance of Eduardo Nunes de Almeida was not just the tragedy of one child. It was the slow, deliberate construction of a convenient forgetting. For years, someone benefited from the silence. Our duty now is to ensure that this silence never returns. Meanwhile, the bicycle, or what was left of it, was officially returned to his mother, not as evidence, but as a memory. The wheel, the fender, the corroded sticker, the twisted chain. Selma asked only that they not clean anything. She wanted to keep it just as he had left it. And then, after 31 years, she closed the living room door, turned off the light, and for the first time in a very long time, she slept. What remained was to understand what had never been said and why no one for so long had wanted to ask. With the official return of the objects to his mother, the public phase of the investigation seemed to have reached its conclusion. But internally, the team of Operation 493 was still grappling with the last and perhaps most important question of the case. Why was Eduardo's body never found? There was no way to close the case with any consistency without at least formulating a plausible hypothesis about what happened to his remains. The absence of bones, teeth, or any biological trace led to two possible scenarios. First, the body was never on that property. The objects were brought there later, either to mislead or for some other reason. Second, the body had been there but was later removed, destroyed, or had decomposed in such a way that no fragments remained. To try and answer this, forensic experts from the scientific police ran physical and chemical simulations based on the soil conditions and the materials found. After detailed laboratory analyses, a technical report was drafted containing the following conclusion. There is clear evidence of successive manipulation of the soil between 1991 and 1993, with the presence of degraded organic material. It is plausible that human remains were disposed of there and degraded to the point of leaving no identifiable bone fragments, especially if subjected to heat, chemicals, or excessive time under compacted rubble. This finding was not a definitive answer, but it legally allowed the case to be considered a homicide with presumed concealment of a body. Based on this, the public ministry decided to close the criminal investigation against Arlindo Lacerda without a homicide charge, but with an official record stating that the evidence pointed to the concealment of evidence and possible passive participation in covering up a death. The case was officially archived in June 2023 without a trial. The city reacted with weariness. There was nothing to celebrate, no one left to mourn publicly. There was only acceptance. The bicycle wheel was put on symbolic display at the city council during a session marking the 32nd anniversary of the disappearance. On a table next to candles and artificial flowers, a small plaque read, "Here lies what remains of the interrupted childhood of Eduardo, and of an entire city that learned too late to listen to the silence." That same month, a group of residents created the Eduardo Nunes Memorial, an open space near the neighborhood's central square with a bench, a newly planted tree, and a mural of photos of the boy. It was simple, discreet, but constantly visited. And then, at a pace no one could quite define, the city returned to normal. The streets resumed their flow, neighbors went back to talking about politics, soccer, the price of gas, but something was different, especially among the older residents. A new understanding that time does not heal, it only quiets. And the silence would never be heard the same way again. Meanwhile, on his farm in Campo Magro, Arlindo Lacerda remained a recluse. His name was never officially cleared, but he was never formally convicted either. He became a man with a heavy past, avoided by his neighbors and ignored by his family. He rarely went out, answered no more questions, never reappeared, and never at any point offered an apology. What is known is that 6 months after the case was archived, he visited a local notary to draft a simple will. In it, he left all his assets to a local evangelical church with the condition that a portion be used for programs supporting at-risk children. The document caught the attention of the prosecutors, who filed it as a complimentary record. Nothing in it was admissible as a confession, but the ethical contradiction of the gesture resonated among those who had followed the story to the end. The press produced reflective articles, reconstruction podcasts, and documentaries narrated over period photos. Eduardo's case began to appear on lists of emblematic, partially solved disappearances. The term no-body cases once again circulated in legal corridors. But for Dona Selma, none of this mattered much. She remained there, in the same house, with the same ferns on the porch. The armchair, the portrait, the gate, everything was the same, except for one detail: On the small table in the living room where once there was only a candle, there was now a wheel, rusted, bent, silent. She couldn't explain why, but she said it felt as if her son was there, not whole, not alive, not found, but finally no longer lost, and that somehow was enough. Not all disappearances end with reunions. Some end with truths that can only be touched, never spoken. In the months that followed the formal archiving of Eduardo's case, the city seemed to walk a tightrope between forgetting and remembrance. The memorial became a daily point of passage. Children played there, as if finally authorized to occupy the space of the boy who, for so long, had existed only as an absence. Some parents would bring their children and quietly tell them the story. Others would simply stop and stare in silence. At the school where Eduardo had studied, now renovated and expanded, the library gained a new wing in his name. A memorial mural was installed in the main hallway. A photo of him, light shirt, a smile showing the gap between his front teeth, his hair parted to the side, was printed in black and white with the inscription, "Every childhood should get to come home." Meanwhile, Dona Selma was going through a process that the neighborhood health team called a silent reorganization of grief. After 3 decades of living in uncertainty, she was now dealing with a definitive absence. There were no more what-ifs, no more searches. There was a different kind of emptiness, one that was beginning to settle. The health center psychologist who visited her weekly noted that Selma had started sleeping more. She drank her coffee slowly. She read the old case clippings not with anger but with a kind of resignation. "It was as if someone had given me back only a part of my son, just a piece," she would say. But I held that piece in my hands. One day during a routine visit, she pulled a time-yellowed letter from her purse. It was from 1992. A child from Eduardo's school had written to the family saying that when he grew up, he wanted to find Dudu. The handwriting was crooked but full of hope. "We're going to find him even if it takes a long time because friends never forget." Selma had kept it for over 30 years. Now she read it aloud and smiled. Not a happy smile, but one of those that is born when pain, even if it never leaves, learns how to breathe. In August 2023, the Operation 493 Task Force was officially disbanded. The final report was presented to the National Council of Justice, highlighting 3 key points. The initial institutional omission was a determining factor in the investigation's failure in the 90s. The absence of biological evidence does not invalidate the responsibility for the concealment of truth, and the case of Eduardo must be treated as a symbol of how the disappearance of one child is always a collective disappearance. The impact of this last point sparked important debates within the judicial system. By the end of 2023, the state of Paraná created a new directorate specifically for reviewing archived, unsolved cases, a project directly inspired by Eduardo's case. The first name on their list? Eduardo Nunes de Almeida. Even in its conclusion, his case continued to open doors. The team that had supported Selma throughout the investigation also decided to say their goodbyes with dignity. In their last official meeting in November, the 3 prosecutors and the psychologist brought her a small symbolic gift, a replica of the red bicycle, a wooden miniature with the name Eduardo engraved on its frame. She held it carefully, tracing the name with her finger, and murmured, "Now he comes home every day." In the months that followed, the city's routine began to adjust. The memorial continued to draw visitors. A local TV station aired a year-end special titled, "The 493 Meters Between the Boy and the Truth," narrated in the first person, as if Eduardo were telling his own story. The response was immense. Thousands of people commented, many saying it reminded them of old cases from their own towns. Some began to share similar stories, some forgotten, others never investigated. Eduardo's case, more than solved, had become a national call to listen. And at the center of it all was a woman with a calm voice and small hands, sitting in a simple house with her son's photograph on a shelf. And now a bicycle replica beside it. She didn't expect justice, she didn't want revenge. She only wished that wherever he was, he knew he had never been left behind. At the end of the year, the city organized a quiet ceremony at the memorial. Candles were lit, children sang, and neighbors embraced Selma without a word. She gave no speech, she just stood there, holding a piece of blue cloth, the same one unearthed years before, now washed and framed. As she placed it on the permanent mural, she said a single sentence. "It's here, my son, now you can rest." The silence that followed was different from all the others. It was a silence that did not ache. It simply concluded. Some disappearances are not resolved with answers, but with the end of the waiting. In the first days of 2024, Curitiba moved on like any big city in January. Intense heat, sudden afternoon rains, children on vacation filling the sidewalks, the sound of bicycles passing in the streets. It was on one of those days that Selma sat for the last time in her porch chair, overlooking the gate. She had started writing letters to herself. They were small notes, kept in an old shoebox where Eduardo's school books used to be. She wrote without dates or signatures, as if he were speaking, or as if she were traveling back in time. One of them read, "Mother, it wasn't your fault. I only left because I thought I'd be right back. But even where I am, I hear you when you turn on the living room light, when you leave a plate in the microwave. We are still a home." These notes were shown to no one. They were hers alone, an intimate way to reorganize a love that never ended. Her therapist called it symbolic processing. She just called it conversations with time. In February, 33 years had passed since Eduardo's disappearance. There was no official ceremony, but on the residents' initiative, the memorial was cleaned, repainted, and adorned with new flowers. A child left a note scribbled in crayon, "Come back and play with us." Selma did not go. She preferred to stay home, but she sent an envelope to the event coordinator containing 3 items: a photocopied picture of the original bicycle, a cassette tape with Eduardo's voice singing a school song, and a handwritten letter with the following passage. "For years, I feared my son had been alone in his final moments. Today, I believe he knew, somehow, that I would stay here until someone found him. Not the body, not the culprits, but the part of him that still needed to be heard." The tape was played on an old radio during the ceremony. The voice was that of a child, clear and in tune, stumbling over the words. Many people cried, others just closed their eyes and listened. For 2 minutes, Eduardo existed again. 6 months later, Selma passed away at home from natural causes. She was found by her niece sitting in her armchair with one of the notes in her hands. She looked serene. The funeral was simple, attended by old neighbors and a few members of the task force who had stayed in touch with her. One of them said, "It was as if she had waited for the story to conclude before she could depart." She was buried in the same cemetery as her husband, with a space beside her marked only by a name, Eduardo. There was no body, but there was a place, and on that stone they engraved a line from one of the notes she had written to herself. "You don't have to come back anymore. Mother has reached you now." The land where it all happened was bought by a technology company, but due to public pressure, they chose to preserve part of the area as a memory garden. In its center stands a concrete circle with a cast metal bicycle, turned on its side and partially buried just like the original. Visitors leave flowers there, and some curious children ask their parents, "Why is that bike like that?" and the parents sometimes don't know what to say. But others kneel, point to the name engraved on the pedestal, and tell the story. Not to frighten, not to blame, but to remember that sometimes a disappearance is not about distance, but about neglect. That Eduardo didn't vanish because he was far away, but because no one was looking where they should have been. In the end, the case was officially filed as unsolved, but for those who followed it, something much greater had been unearthed. Not just objects, memories, or questions, but the awareness that some stories cannot be left behind. And that even without complete justice, there is a dignity to be found in tending to memory. Today, when someone passes the memorial and sees the rusted wheel, the faded sticker, the name etched in metal, they may not know everything that happened, but they feel that there is a story here that matters, an absence that was, at last, heard.